We have our table. The first thing I want to do is set the width. I don't want it to be driven by the content. Everything looks a little bit cramped. And I can do this two ways. I can put in a percentage of the available screen width. So I'll say 50%. I'll save that. And we'll see now that that takes up roughly half my screen. Now if I start to shrink this, you'll notice the table is resizing. It's still trying to fill 50% of the screen. The good part of this is it's responsive. It takes up only that amount of space that I've asked it to, and it allows for the rest of the content to fill the other half of the space. The bad piece of this is, as my table starts to shrink, stuff gets crammed up in there and may or may not look right for me. So percentage is one way, but I could also use pixels. So I could say 250 pixels here. Save that. And now I have a fixed size. And as I start to change, you'll notice now it's a fixed width. It's not changing as the screen changes. So I have a concept of how wide that thing is going to be. So we can do 350. And we could also use the M's. And look at that. And again, we have a fixed width now for our table so that it's going to stay the same size no matter how big the window is. So you can choose whether you want to use percentages or these fixed widths as well. Also, I don't like the fact that it's left aligned, so I'm going to use the align equals center. And remember, I'm using the transitional XHTML doc type here. So while this is deprecated, because I'm using the transitional or loose, it's valid within my document to use that. And so now the client understands that I may be using that, and it's going to render that centered left to right within the page. Again, you can achieve the same thing with styles, especially want to do that if you're using the strict document type definitions. Now let's look at the border. I had this on here just to kind of highlight things. I set the border equals 1. We could set the border equal to 5, and we'll see that if we re-render, the outside border is much thicker now. So we see that it's 5 pixels wide, whereas the inside still has these small borders. This is kind of a little bit quirky. This is how the browsers do it. I'm really defining this outer border, but as soon as I do, browsers almost in every case are going to render these inner borders as well around the individual table cells and table headers. So border is kind of the simple way to do this. Notice that I don't get a whole lot of control over those things. So if I do 10, I can control the outside, but I'm not really controlling the inner borders here. So the other thing I can do is get a little more granular, and I can use something called the frame and the rules. So I'm going to do frame equals border and rules equal all. And you'll see now that I have a border around this. And I also have these rules or these lines in between the various cells. They're very narrow. It looks different than the border did. And if I want to, then I can just say I want rules just on the columns. You'll see now I just get the vertical rules here in between the columns. But I'm also still getting the border around the outside. And if I want to, I can set rules equal to none. And then I just have the border around the outside. So the frame and the rules have different settings where you can decide whether you want just the vertical lines on the border or the horizontal lines. The rules allow you to have more strict control over what's available inside the table in terms of the vertical and horizontal rules that go on in there. These, again, are things that are available on table. They're still there. But you can also leverage style sheets, which is probably more common, to go in and apply to the table cells or the table rows various styles where border would be one of those things. So you may go into particular table cells based on their class or all table data elements and apply a particular style to set the border for that item. Now I set this back to a border of 2 because the last thing I want to show you is the cell padding and the cell spacing, and that only works really well with the border setup this way. If you use rules, you don't see all of this as visually. So for the cell padding, I'm going to set that to, let's make it easy, 10 pixels, and we'll save that. And what you'll notice is you can see how unordered list right now is jammed up against the left side, as are all the tags. And so if we change that now and say that we want the padding to be 10 pixels, I've now added this buffer of 10 pixels between my content and the edge of the cell. So the table padding really gives you the pad around that content, but within the borders of the cell. If we add the cell spacing in, similarly added as 10 pixels, then when we refresh, we'll see now it's not within the cells, it's this space in between the cells now that's set up as 10 pixels. So now we've got some spacing between the cells themselves. So you can use both of those things to functionally lay out that table. If you need a little more room around the content, use the cell padding. The cell spacing gives you the ability to provide room in between the rows and columns as you're going. Now note that even though this particular table data element spans 2 rows, so we don't see it in between there, it still applies the right spacing and still lines up correctly along these items based on the cell spacing and cell padding, because this is treated as one cell as it was declared in the document.